Hello, my name is Isabel Cristina Volemarson. The title of my presentation is Remodeling Practices in Higher Education in Brazil Towards Concepts of Multiliteracies and Translanguaging in the Classroom. To contextualize, I have been teaching at the State University of Ponta Grossa, a tuition-free university in the south of Brazil. I have been teaching English to pre-service teachers since 2013, and I'm going to present the partial results of a research project. So, teacher education is a contested topic, especially in the light of globalization, the diversity of cultures and languages spoken worldwide. In this scenario, this study discusses the results of a qualitative research project involving pre-service teaching education, multiliteracies, and English as a lingua franca. Well, I'm going to discuss specifically two sub-projects from scientific initiation research. So I developed this project with undergraduate students at the university. The first sub-project involved one undergraduate student in her last year of the major. She worked as an English teacher for kids between 7 to 8 years old in a private school during the pandemic of COVID-19. So the project was called Rethinking Teacher Education and Multiliteracies in Pandemic Times. She used a narrative, autobiographical study, so she could use this narrative to explain her experiences during the period. What can we say about this specific project? Besides the bibliographical research, the undergraduate student had to talk about some uncertainties and instabilities that she had during the pandemic. So she read authors who had to modify their praxis or their face-to-face classes to remote ones. So they had to work in different perspectives. So they had to use multimodal tools to try to help them to give their classes. We could observe that teacher educators had to act in different ways to adapt the context. So they had to kind of self-reflection of practice to deal with different perspectives. In relation to the methodological approach, we could say that this theoretic underpinning that guides the studies based on the study of multiliteracies, multimodality, and the use of digital information and communication technologies. So during COVID-19, teachers had to change the face-to-face to remote classes and had to use some tools that were not used during face-to-face classes. In relation to the methodological approach, the research is qualitative. So we try to adapt our classes to the possibilities we had. So as Freire says, within the limiting situations we had, so teachers were presented some difficult situations during pandemic, so they had to deal with this untested feasibility, or in other words, we can say they had to find different possibilities to change, to resist, to reevaluate the praxis. So they had to use different kinds of tools, for example, Meet, YouTube, Zoom, and other platforms to teach English, okay? In relation to the first results that we had from this praxis reflection, what can we say? In her narrative, the student talked about the changes from face-to-face classes to the remote ones, she could perceive that she could perceive some differences in students' development. So she could say that when she was in face-to-face class, it was easier because she could help students in class. But in this new environment, it was difficult to keep the students' attention to the screen, for example. So she needed some support of parents to do homework, to pay attention to the remote classes, so she could realize that students didn't pay attention so long for the classes. So she learned to construct meaning in different, dialogical perspective, so she could do some collaborative way with parents to help the students. Teachers had to learn to teach in a new way without having models, okay? So this kind of, they learn to act and teach without previous models. The second subproject involved concepts of language and translanguages in written texts. We had another student, undergraduate student, who participated in this project. It was a scientific initiation research again, involved one student from the second grade. We discussed other authors related to translanguage, and she made also a lecture about the topic with the student from the second year of the major in November of 2022. So she did bibliographical study, and she did this lecture too. In relation to the theoretical background, it involved authors who discuss language, like CANAGARAJAH, Garcia and Way, OTHEGUY, Garcia and Reid. And also, we discussed texts about authors who discuss the analysis of translanguaging in written texts. So we have some examples here. So we discussed how these authors, they analyze the texts about translanguaging. In relation to the corpus, so the methodology that we used, the corpus is composed by 90 texts that we have from formal writing evaluation. We have already analyzed half of them. We worked with content analysis to try to analyze the cases of translanguaging these texts. What can we have from these partial results? So from these 9 texts, we have 50 have been just analyzed. We divided translanguage in 2 categories: translanguage as a strategy and translanguage as multimodality. I'm going to show and explain some examples that we perceived in these classes, in these texts, how students use translanguaging in their written texts. So, in relation to translanguage as a strategy, students use translanguage as a way to communicate, to construct meaning. In these examples, in Texto 13, we could say there are disadvantages too. As you can see here, the disadvantages is considered wrong in standard English, but the construction can be considered creative because the student, for Brazilians, the word disadvantage is called desvantagem. So we could perceive here that the student link the prefix "das" plus vantage, so the person mixed a bit of Portuguese and English in the same word. So it's something creative. In the second example, Texto 8, we can see the climate's better in some countries. So the correct word in English here would be climate or weather, but the person used a vowel at the end of the word clima in Portuguese, and is something that it becomes a kind of creative use again. In the same text, we could say the word prefere. So prefer is a is a verb in English, okay? But in Portuguese, it's preferir. So the person just changed the vowel at the end of the word and try to mix a kind of Portuguese and English at the same time, okay? So is a verb strategy, is a kind of changed the vowel just to speak in English. Another example as a strategy, so translanguage as a strategy, we can say that this program is good for children and your education. So in this example, we have the transfers of some syntactic rules from Portuguese to English. So we can say that this possessive adjective, your, must be used to refer to you in English. But in Portuguese, sometimes we can use also in the third person, seu, sua. So the person transferred the knowledge of Portuguese to English. So in English, the possessive adjectives changes when you have different subjects. So here, the person used the same rule from Portuguese to English. In relation to translanguage as multimodality, in texto 6, we could say that the student underlined the date, so AKA, as known as. So America celebrates Independence Day on July 4th. So she put an arrow and put something that can be important to call the reader's attention here. So I think that this is a kind of multimodal strategy to call the reader's attention. In the next example, texto 32, the students sometimes use some quotation marks and symbols to call the reader's attention again. So we have, I have already seen it, the correct use here. I'm afraid of his driving skills. So skills, she put quotation marks just to say that this skills is something that scares her, maybe. And these quotation marks is considered something multimodal. And this, at the end of the message, she put hugs and kisses. So it's something that can call the reader's attention. So I think that they are examples of multimodality. What can we say about these examples that we had? So in relation to the first subproject, we can say that changing praxis, the students had to deal with uncertainty, instability that we lived during the pandemic, and they had to create new possibilities. So in this perspective, information and communication technologies were useful for them. So we have positive and negative possibilities about this pandemic, but for this student was something good. So the use of tools, the technological tools, was something good for her. In relation to the second subproject, we can say that translanguage can be seen as a social construct, not as a specific mistakes that people do in English. These students try to use the whole repertoire to construct meaning. So they are constructing their own linguistic repertoire. We can also say that students could not only expand the borders between languages, but they can expand also the semiotic resource they use when they are communicating. And we can say that the notion of repertoire is linked with the students' identities and social experiences. So here are my references, okay, that I use in this study. And thank you very much.